Sometimes, the smallest chair in the room reveals the biggest secret in the family. The ballroom glowed beneath thousands of tiny lights suspended from a ceiling that seemed to disappear into gold and crystal. Every table was dressed in white linen. Every glass sparkled. Every guest looked as though they belonged on the cover of a magazine. It was the wedding event of the year. The Hayes family had spent months planning every detail. Reporters waited outside. Investors filled the room. Political leaders, business executives, and celebrities moved between tables while a string quartet played softly near the stage. At the center of it all stood Margaret Hayes. Elegant, impeccably dressed, completely in control. She moved through the ballroom like someone inspecting a masterpiece she had personally created. Nothing escaped her attention. Not a crooked flower arrangement. Not a misplaced place card. And certainly not a little boy sitting at the family table. 7-year-old Ethan Mitchell swung his feet beneath a chair that was slightly too tall for him. He wore a navy suit that had been carefully pressed that morning. His blonde hair had been combed 3 times by his mother before they left their apartment. He sat quietly, studying the silverware in front of him with the fascination only children possess. Beside him stood Sarah Mitchell. She adjusted the sleeve of her simple blue dress and glanced around the room. She had never liked events like this. Too much attention. Too many people pretending not to judge each other. Yet Ethan had been excited all week. She wanted him to have one happy evening. For a moment, everything seemed fine. Then Margaret noticed the child. Her smile disappeared. She walked toward the table without hesitation. Several relatives stepped aside immediately. People always moved when Margaret approached. She stopped beside Ethan and stared at the place card in front of him. Then she looked at Sarah. There must be some mistake. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "Excuse me." Margaret reached down and lifted the place card from the table. The motion was smooth, casual, almost effortless. "This seat is reserved for family." The conversation around nearby tables began to fade. People listened without appearing to listen. Sarah remained calm. "We were told to sit here." Margaret looked at Ethan briefly before turning back to Sarah. "Your son cannot sit at the family table." The words landed harder than she intended, or perhaps exactly as she intended. Ethan looked up, confused. "Mom." Sarah forced a smile. "It is okay, sweetheart." But it was not okay. Everyone nearby knew it. The silence spreading through the room confirmed it. Margaret removed the chair slightly from the table. Not enough to create a scene, just enough to send a message. Ethan stared at the empty space where he had been sitting seconds earlier. Then he asked the question every child asks when adults forget children are listening. "Did I do something wrong?" No one answered immediately. Across the ballroom, a set of double doors opened. The music shifted. Guests turned toward the entrance. Alexander Hayes had arrived. The billionaire groom stood at the far end of the grand aisle prepared for the evening ceremony. Cameras immediately focused on him. Conversations resumed. Attention shifted, but only for a moment, because as Alexander began walking forward, he heard something. A child's voice. Small. Uncertain. "Did I do something wrong?" Alexander stopped. Completely. One step frozen in place. The music continued for another few seconds before musicians slowly lowered their bows. The room noticed. Guests exchanged nervous glances. Margaret noticed too. Alexander was no longer looking toward the altar. He was staring directly at the family table. And for the first time all evening, something in his expression made the entire ballroom feel suddenly uneasy. The ballroom remained frozen. Hundreds of people stood suspended between confusion and curiosity. Alexander Hayes had stopped walking. For a man known for making decisions quickly, the hesitation was impossible to ignore. At the family table, Sarah Mitchell felt every eye in the room turning toward them. She wished they would not. Attention had never brought anything good into her life. She lowered herself beside Ethan and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did nothing wrong," she whispered. Ethan nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the empty space where his chair had been. Children often understood more than adults realized. They could feel exclusion long before they understood its reasons. Sarah knew that look. She had worn it herself years ago, long before the expensive ballroom, long before the Hayes family, long before life became a series of difficult choices disguised as responsibilities. 7 years earlier, Sarah's world looked completely different. She had been 24 years old and working double shifts at a downtown hotel in Manhattan. Every morning began before sunrise. Every evening ended with sore feet and exhausted muscles. Yet she rarely complained. There was something steady about her, something resilient. Other employees noticed it. Guests noticed it. Even managers noticed it. Sarah carried herself with quiet dignity that seemed immune to circumstances. When life became difficult, she simply worked harder. When people underestimated her, she smiled and continued forward. That habit never changed. Not even after Ethan was born. Raising a child alone had not been part of her plan. Neither had the long nights balancing rent payments, school supplies, medical appointments, and work schedules. But plans and reality rarely followed the same path. So she adapted. She learned how to stretch every dollar, how to survive on less sleep, how to turn small victories into reasons for gratitude. Most importantly, she learned how to shield Ethan from burdens that belonged to adults. To him, life remained simple. Saturday pancakes, library visits, soccer practice at the neighborhood park, bedtime stories. He never knew how carefully every month had been calculated. Sarah preferred it that way. Across the ballroom, Margaret Hayes stood perfectly still. She had spent decades protecting the Hayes family image. To her, appearances mattered. Tradition mattered. Structure mattered. She believed every person had a place, and every place had rules. Tonight, she saw herself as preserving order. Nothing more. Yet the atmosphere around her suggested otherwise. Guests who had quietly agreed with her moments earlier now seemed uncertain. The discomfort was spreading. Alexander remained at the far end of the aisle. The musicians waited. The wedding coordinator waited. Even the photographers hesitated. Nobody knew what came next. Then Alexander slowly turned his head toward Michael Bennett, the wedding host standing near the stage. The older man immediately sensed something unusual. Michael had known Alexander for nearly 20 years. He recognized that expression. It appeared only when something truly mattered. Not business deals. Not public appearances. Personal matters. The dangerous kind. Sarah noticed it too. For reasons she could not explain, a strange feeling settled in her chest. Not fear. Not hope. Something in between. Ethan tugged gently at her sleeve. "Mom." She looked down. "Yes." His voice was small. "Why is everyone looking at us?" Sarah forced a smile despite the knot forming in her stomach. "I do not know, sweetheart." But deep down, she suspected the answer was coming. Because across the ballroom, Alexander Hayes finally took another step. Not toward the altar. Not toward the stage. He was walking directly toward the family table. Every guest watched Alexander Hayes cross the ballroom. The distance was not far. Perhaps 40 feet. Yet it felt much longer. Each step seemed to pull the room deeper into uncertainty. Conversations had completely disappeared. The string quartet remained silent. Even the photographers lowered their cameras, sensing that whatever was happening no longer belonged to a wedding schedule. It belonged to something else. Something personal. Sarah Mitchell stood beside Ethan and tried to remain calm. She had spent years teaching herself how to survive uncomfortable situations without showing fear. Tonight that skill was being tested. She had not spoken to Alexander in nearly 8 years. Not once. Not a phone call. Not an email. Not even an accidental meeting in a city filled with millions of people. Yet now he was walking directly toward her. Toward Ethan. Toward a truth she had spent years keeping locked away behind ordinary routines and quiet sacrifices. Ethan looked up at the approaching billionaire with innocent curiosity. To him, Alexander was simply a man in an expensive suit. Another adult at another formal event. Nothing more. Children did not see status. They saw faces, voices, expressions. And something about Alexander's expression caught Ethan's attention. It was not anger. It was not confusion. It looked almost familiar. Across the room, Margaret Hayes felt control slipping away. She disliked surprises, especially public ones. "Alexander," she called gently. "The ceremony is waiting." He did not stop. He did not even look toward her. That alone caused several relatives to exchange nervous glances. Alexander had always respected his mother. Yet tonight his focus remained fixed on one table. One woman. One child. Michael Bennett watched carefully from near the stage. He remembered a conversation that had taken place earlier that morning. A private conversation inside Alexander's office overlooking Manhattan. The billionaire had received a sealed envelope from a family attorney. He had read the contents twice. Then a third time. For nearly 10 minutes, he had said nothing at all. Michael remembered the look on his face. Shock, regret, and something deeper. something almost impossible to hide. Back at the family table, Alexander finally stopped. Close enough now to see Ethan clearly. The little boy's blonde hair, the shape of his smile, the curious blue eyes staring back at him. For a moment, nobody spoke. The silence felt fragile. Then Ethan offered a polite smile. "Hi." Several guests unexpectedly smiled with him. Alexander's expression softened immediately. "Hello, Ethan." Sarah froze. Her heartbeat quickened. She had never introduced them. Not tonight. Not ever. Yet Alexander knew his name. Ethan tilted his head. "You know who I am?" The question hung in the air. Sarah looked down. Alexander looked at the boy, then at Sarah. Years of unanswered questions seemed to pass between them without a single word. Margaret noticed the exchange and felt unease settle into her chest. Something was happening that she did not understand. Something much larger than a seating arrangement. Alexander slowly glanced toward the empty chair that had been removed from the table. Then he looked at the place card still resting in Margaret's hand. His expression became serious again. Calm, controlled, but unmistakably serious. Finally, in a voice quiet enough to force the entire room to listen, he asked a question no one had expected. "Who removed my son's seat?" The question seemed to drain the air from the ballroom. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. For several long seconds, even the sound of breathing felt too loud. Alexander Hayes stood beside the table, his gaze fixed not on Sarah, not on Ethan, but on the empty space where the chair had been. Margaret Hayes tightened her grip on the place card. She had spent decades commanding rooms with confidence. Yet something about her son's voice unsettled her. It was not anger. Anger could be managed. This was certainty, and certainty was far more dangerous. Finally, Margaret lifted her chin. "I removed it." A murmur spread through the guests. Alexander nodded once. Calmly. "Why?" Margaret glanced around the room as if searching for support. "Because family seating is reserved for family." The explanation sounded reasonable, at least on the surface. Several relatives looked relieved. The answer fit the narrative they preferred. The child did not belong there. The issue was solved. The ceremony could continue. Yet Alexander did not move. His eyes shifted toward Ethan. The boy sat quietly beside Sarah now, watching the adults with growing confusion. Then Alexander looked back at Margaret. "Who told you he was not family?" The question landed harder than the first. Margaret blinked. "Alexander, who told you?" His tone remained steady. The room grew silent again. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She had imagined this moment many times over the years. None of those versions had looked like this. None of them had happened in front of hundreds of strangers beneath crystal chandeliers. Ethan tugged gently at her hand. She squeezed it back. Across the ballroom, Michael Bennett watched the scene unfold with growing understanding. The envelope, the attorney, the sudden request Alexander had made that morning to alter the seating chart. Pieces were beginning to connect. Margaret attempted a smile. "I am simply protecting family traditions." Alexander nodded slowly. Traditions? The word lingered in the air. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Several guests exchanged confused glances. Sarah immediately recognized the movement. Her heart nearly stopped. She knew exactly what document he was carrying, because she had once carried a matching copy herself. 8 years ago, before the phone call stopped, before the letters went unanswered, before circumstances separated two lives that had once seemed impossible to separate. Alexander unfolded a single sheet of paper. Nothing dramatic, nothing elaborate, yet the sight of it made Sarah lower her eyes. Margaret stared at the document. "What is that?" For the first time, a trace of emotion appeared in Alexander's voice. Not anger, not resentment. Regret. Deep regret. Something I should have seen years ago. Several guests leaned forward. The room felt suspended between two realities. The wedding everyone expected, and the truth that was slowly emerging beneath it. Ethan looked up at Alexander. "Are you in trouble?" The innocence of the question almost broke the tension. A few guests smiled despite themselves. Alexander looked at the boy. For the first time that evening, he smiled too. A small smile. A genuine one. "No, Ethan." His voice softened. "I think I spent a very long time being late." Confusion crossed the child's face. But before he could ask another question, Alexander turned back toward Margaret, then toward the entire room. The paper remained in his hand. "This morning," he said quietly, "I received confirmation of something that should have been part of my life for the last 7 years." The silence that followed felt endless, because everyone in the ballroom suddenly understood that this was no longer about a chair. No one seemed willing to breathe. The ballroom had transformed from a wedding venue into a room waiting for a verdict. Alexander Hayes stood with the folded document in his hand while hundreds of guests watched. Sarah Mitchell remained frozen beside Ethan. She had spent years preparing herself for difficult conversations. Yet she had never prepared for this one. Not here. Not like this. Margaret Hayes stared at her son. Alexander, whatever this is, perhaps it can wait until after the ceremony. Her voice remained composed, but the confidence underneath it was beginning to crack. Alexander looked at her gently. Not with anger, not with blame, only with disappointment. It already waited 7 years. The words settled heavily across the room. Several relatives exchanged uneasy glances. Michael Bennett lowered his eyes. He knew the story was only beginning. Ethan looked between the adults, trying to understand. 7 years is my whole life, he said innocently. The statement struck the room with surprising force. Because it was true. Every missed birthday, every school event, every bedtime story, every scraped knee, and every accomplishment. 7 years was not simply a number. It was an entire childhood. Alexander slowly knelt until he was closer to Ethan's eye level. The billionaire who commanded boardrooms worth billions now seemed concerned only with one small boy. You are right, he said softly. It is. Ethan studied him for a moment. Are you one of Mom's friends? Sarah closed her eyes briefly. The question hurt more than she expected. Alexander smiled sadly. I should have been. Silence followed. The answer was simple, honest, and somehow far more powerful than a long explanation. Margaret looked toward Sarah. For the first time all evening, uncertainty replaced judgment. What is he talking about? She asked quietly. Sarah did not answer immediately. She never wanted this truth revealed through conflict. If it came out, she wanted it to come from facts, not emotions. Alexander rose slowly and unfolded the document. 8 years ago, Sarah and I were together. A murmur moved through the ballroom. Several guests looked stunned. Others immediately began connecting details that suddenly made sense. Alexander continued. Then circumstances separated us. His eyes drifted briefly toward Sarah. There was no accusation in them, only regret. I believed she had chosen to leave without explanation. Sarah lowered her gaze. She remembered the letters she had sent, the phone calls that were never returned, the messages that disappeared into silence. At the time, she thought Alexander had made his choice. Years later, she discovered many of those messages had never reached him. But by then, life had already moved forward. Or at least it appeared to. Alexander looked at the document in his hand. This morning, I learned the truth. The room became silent again. Margaret's face slowly paled. Something inside her already knew where this was heading. Alexander continued. An attorney discovered correspondence that had been misplaced during a family legal dispute years ago. Michael Bennett closed his eyes briefly. He remembered that conversation too. The attorney had called it an administrative failure. Alexander called it something else. Lost years. Then Alexander looked directly at Ethan. The little boy stared back at him with innocent curiosity. Finally, Alexander spoke the words everyone already suspected but no one was prepared to hear. Ethan is my son. The silence that followed seemed to stop time itself. Because in a single sentence, the empty chair no longer looked like a seating mistake. It looked like a place that had belonged to him all along. The words echoed through the ballroom long after Alexander stopped speaking. Ethan is my son. No dramatic music followed. No one gasped loudly. The silence itself carried more weight than any reaction could. Hundreds of guests sat frozen beneath the chandeliers, each person recalculating everything they thought they understood about the evening. Margaret Hayes slowly lowered herself into a nearby chair. For the first time in many years, she seemed uncertain. Not because her son had spoken publicly, because she realized the child she had just excluded had never been an outsider at all. Ethan looked from Alexander to Sarah, then back to Alexander again. His young face tightened with concentration. You are my dad, he asked. The simplicity of the question pierced through every layer of wealth, status, and family politics in the room. Alexander swallowed hard. Of all the conversations he had prepared for today, none felt as important as this one. Yes, he answered quietly. I am. Ethan studied him for a few seconds. Then he asked the question only a child would think to ask first. Do you like soccer? Several guests unexpectedly laughed. The tension softened for a moment. Alexander smiled. A genuine smile this time. I do. Ethan nodded seriously. Good. The answer seemed to satisfy him. Sarah looked away briefly as emotion threatened to surface. 7 years of difficult mornings and lonely nights suddenly felt very close. She had never expected perfection. She had never expected rescue. She only wanted Ethan to grow up knowing he was loved. Across the room, Michael Bennett quietly motioned for the wedding staff to remain where they were. No one was thinking about the ceremony anymore. Something far more meaningful was happening. Alexander turned toward the guests. There is something everyone deserves to know. His voice remained calm. Sarah never hid Ethan from me. The statement immediately shifted attention again. Several relatives exchanged surprised looks. Margaret slowly raised her eyes. Alexander continued. For years, I believed she chose to disappear. He glanced toward Sarah. That belief was wrong. Sarah remained silent. She never enjoyed defending herself. Facts usually did a better job than arguments. Alexander held up the document. The attorney's investigation found letters, legal notifications, and messages that were never delivered because of an administrative dispute involving family representatives. A heavy silence settled across the room. Nobody needed additional details. The conclusion was obvious enough. Lost communication had created lost years. Alexander looked toward Ethan again. Regret flashed briefly across his face. Not theatrical regret. The quiet kind. The kind that arrives when time cannot be recovered. I missed 7 years I can never get back. The honesty in his voice affected everyone, even people who had never met him before. Margaret lowered her gaze. For perhaps the first time all evening, she was no longer thinking about family reputation. She was thinking about family itself. Ethan looked up at his mother. Does that mean he missed my birthday parties? Sarah nodded gently. Ethan considered this carefully. That is sad. No one disagreed. Alexander slowly approached the table and picked up the chair that had been removed earlier. The room watched in complete silence. He carried it back to its original position. Then he adjusted it carefully beside the family table. Not quickly, not dramatically, deliberately, as though restoring something that should never have been moved in the first place. When he finished, he looked at Ethan and smiled. I think your seat belongs here. And for the first time that evening, the room began to understand that the chair had never been the real story. It was the years behind it. The ballroom remained silent as Alexander stepped away from the chair he had just returned to its rightful place. The gesture had lasted only a few seconds, yet it carried the weight of 7 lost years. Ethan looked at the chair, then at Alexander, then at his mother. So I can sit there now? He asked. A few guests smiled. Children had a remarkable ability to reduce life's most complicated moments to their simplest truth. Alexander nodded. Yes. Ethan looked relieved. Okay. Then he sat down as though nothing extraordinary had happened, as though he had not just become the center of the most unexpected moment in the history of the Hayes family. Sarah could not help smiling. For 7 years, she had watched her son navigate the world with kindness and curiosity. Tonight was no different. While adults wrestled with regret, pride, and unanswered questions, Ethan was mostly concerned with whether he was allowed to sit in his chair. Across the room, many guests found themselves looking at the boy differently now. Not because of wealth, not because of inheritance, because of the quiet dignity with which he had endured embarrassment without understanding why it was happening. Margaret Hayes remained seated. The confidence that had defined her throughout the evening seemed distant now. She watched Ethan carefully. The same child she had dismissed less than an hour earlier. The same child whose seat she had removed without hesitation. And for the first time, she truly saw him. Not as a problem, not as an inconvenience. As her grandson, the realization settled heavily upon her. Michael Bennett quietly approached the table. He glanced at Alexander before speaking softly. The ceremony can be delayed if necessary. Alexander looked around the room, then at Sarah, then at Ethan. For a moment, the billionaire appeared less concerned with schedules than with the people standing in front of him. Thank you, he said. But there is something I need to do first. Sarah felt her heart tighten. She did not know what he intended to say. Neither did anyone else. Alexander slowly turned toward her. Every guest watched. Not because they wanted drama, because they recognized sincerity when they saw it. Alexander took a breath. Sarah. She met his eyes. For years she had imagined what this conversation might sound like. Anger. Accusations. explanations. None of those appeared. Instead, she saw regret. Honest regret. I cannot change what happened. His voice was quiet. I cannot give Ethan the years I missed. The room listened carefully. And I cannot undo the burden you carried alone. Sarah looked down briefly. The words reached places she had spent years protecting. Alexander continued. But I am sorry. No grand speech followed. No attempt to justify the past. No effort to shift responsibility elsewhere. Just 3 simple words spoken honestly. Sarah remained silent for several seconds. Then she nodded once. I know. The answer surprised many people. They expected confrontation, resentment, perhaps even anger. Instead, they witnessed something rarer. Understanding. Not because the past no longer mattered. Because carrying it forever would help no one. Ethan looked between them. Are you friends again? Several guests laughed softly. Alexander smiled. Sarah did too. The question lingered in the air. Simple. Innocent. Difficult. Finally, Sarah looked at her son. We are figuring that out. Ethan seemed satisfied. Across the ballroom, Margaret slowly rose from her chair. Her eyes remained fixed on Ethan. Then she looked at Sarah. For the first time all evening, there was no judgment in her expression, only reflection, and perhaps the beginning of something she never expected to feel. Regret. For a long moment, no one spoke. The tension that had dominated the evening had faded, leaving something quieter behind. Reflection. The guests who had arrived expecting a glamorous wedding now found themselves witnessing something far more memorable. A family discovering itself in real time. Ethan sat comfortably in his chair, completely unaware that he had become the center of every conversation in the room. He was examining the dinner menu with intense concentration. Do they really have 3 kinds of macaroni and cheese? He asked. A few people nearby smiled. Alexander laughed softly. Apparently they do. Ethan looked impressed. That seems like too many. The simple observation broke whatever tension remained. Around the ballroom, people began relaxing again. Conversations returned, but they sounded different now. Less concerned with appearances, more focused on what they had just witnessed. Margaret Hayes stood quietly beside the table. For perhaps the first time in years, she did not know exactly what to say. Throughout her life, she had believed that good intentions were enough. Tonight she was confronting a painful truth. Good intentions could still hurt people when they were built on assumptions. Her eyes settled on Sarah. The young woman had every reason to be angry, yet she had never raised her voice, never created a scene, never demanded anything. That realization lingered heavily in Margaret's mind. Finally, she stepped closer. Sarah looked up. The ballroom seemed to notice immediately. Another important moment was unfolding. Margaret took a slow breath. Sarah. Her voice was quieter than usual. I owe you an apology. Several guests lowered their eyes respectfully. Sarah remained calm. Margaret continued. Not because I made a mistake tonight. She paused. Because I made that mistake before tonight ever began. The honesty surprised everyone, including Sarah. Margaret looked toward Ethan. I saw a waitress. Then back at Sarah. I should have seen a mother. The words carried no excuses, no conditions, only accountability. Sarah studied her for a moment. She saw something unfamiliar there. Humility. Real humility. Not the kind people performed in public. The kind that arrived only after a difficult lesson. Sarah nodded gently. Thank you. Nothing more. Nothing less. Margaret's shoulders relaxed slightly. Sometimes forgiveness began with a simple acknowledgement. Nearby, Michael Bennett finally approached the microphone. The wedding schedule was beyond repair. Yet somehow nobody seemed concerned. He smiled toward the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, I have hosted hundreds of events. Soft laughter spread through the room. This is the first time a seating chart has completely rewritten the evening. The crowd laughed again. Even Margaret smiled. Michael continued. I suspect none of us will forget it. That much was true. Alexander looked around the ballroom. Faces that had once viewed Sarah as an outsider now regarded her with respect. Not because of her connection to him, because of who she had been long before anyone knew the truth. Ethan suddenly looked up at Alexander. If you are my dad, does that mean you missed all my soccer goals? The question landed unexpectedly. Alexander smiled sadly. Probably all of them. Ethan thought for a second. Then he shrugged. That is okay. The room grew quiet again. There will be more. Alexander blinked. Several guests did the same. Children often carried wisdom adults complicated. Ethan returned to studying his menu. For him, the future was simple. There would be more games, more birthdays, more chances. Around him, the adults were beginning to realize the same thing. The story of the past could not be rewritten, but the story ahead remained completely unwritten. And for the first time all evening, that possibility felt brighter than anything the ballroom lights could illuminate. Several hours later, the ballroom looked different. The flowers were the same. The chandeliers still sparkled overhead. The music still drifted through the room. Yet something had changed. The evening no longer belonged to a wedding schedule or a carefully planned event. It belonged to a story no one had expected. Guests who had arrived discussing business opportunities and social connections now found themselves talking about family, forgiveness, and second chances. Ethan sat happily at the family table, finishing a dessert that seemed far more important to him than inheritance, wealth, or family revelations. A small smear of chocolate rested near the corner of his mouth. Sarah reached over and wiped it away. He immediately smiled. Some things never changed. Across from them, Alexander watched quietly. Throughout the evening, he had found himself memorizing small details. The way Ethan tilted his head when thinking. The way he smiled before asking a question. The way he looked toward Sarah whenever he felt uncertain. 7 years of missed moments stretched behind him. Yet for the first time all day, he was not focused on what had been lost. He was focused on what remained possible. Margaret Hayes sat nearby. Earlier, she had worried about appearances. Now she watched her grandson laugh at something Michael Bennett had just said. The sound surprised her. Not because it was loud, because it felt familiar. There was something unmistakably Hayes about it. She smiled despite herself. Then she glanced toward Sarah. The young woman noticed and offered a polite smile in return. It was a small gesture, but it carried more healing than either of them expected. Near the stage, Michael tapped his glass gently. The room gradually quieted. He looked around at the guests and smiled. I believe tonight has taught us all something. Soft laughter moved through the ballroom. No one disagreed. Michael continued. Sometimes the most important person at the table is the one everyone nearly overlooks. Several guests nodded. Others lowered their eyes thoughtfully. The statement felt less like a speech and more like a lesson. Alexander rose from his chair. For a moment, the room wondered if he intended to make a formal announcement. Instead, he walked around the table and stopped beside Ethan. The boy looked up. What is happening now? Alexander smiled. I was wondering if you might want to come with me tomorrow. Ethan's eyes widened. Where? Your soccer practice. The answer arrived so naturally that it took a second to register. Ethan stared at him. Then a grin spread across his face. Really? Alexander nodded. If that is okay with you. Ethan looked toward Sarah. She smiled gently. That sounds like a good idea. The boy immediately returned his attention to Alexander. Then you should come early. I score most of my goals in the first half. Laughter spread through the room again. Alexander smiled. I would not want to miss them. As the evening finally came to an end, guests began leaving one by one. The city lights outside glittered against the Manhattan skyline. Sarah gathered her coat. Ethan held her hand with one side and reached for Alexander's hand with the other. The gesture happened so naturally that nobody commented on it. They simply noticed and smiled. Near the ballroom entrance, Margaret watched them walk together. Not as strangers, not as opponents, not as symbols of different worlds. As family. The future would not be perfect. There would be difficult conversations. Lost time could never be recovered completely. But something important had happened that night. A chair had been returned to its place. And in doing so, so had a child. Because the truth never needed to shout. It only needed a moment when everyone was finally willing to listen.